Hi. Let's take a few minutes to talk about sort of our second phase in the mediation process. We're going to call this the storytelling phase. I want to talk really about three things today. I want to talk about the storytelling phase, but I also want to get you started thinking about positions and interest because they're just critically important to this first part of the mediation process. Remember, this is kind of the exploring part when we talk about the 7 different phases as we go along. This is the exploring part. This is the where I unpack. This is the sometimes hard, difficult, emotional, complicated part of that process. And then lastly, I want to just sort of tiptoe into talking about perspectives and what I bring to my perspective of the conflict. So let's go back to storytelling. You've finished your 2 or 3 minute, maybe 3 or 4 minute opening. You've set the foundation, you've created the context, you've laid the expectations out, and you have a transitional sentence. And it goes something like, I think I talk about it on your second or third slide in the deck that I've uploaded for you. You really turn to both parties and you go, remember when I talked to you in the confirmation call? I said you'd have an opportunity to explain without being interrupted your perspective about sort of how we got here, what happened. And so turn to one of the parties first and you say, Steve, why don't you go first? Why don't you tell me a little bit about how we got here? Or you turn to the other party and go, Steve, why don't you sort of share your perspective on the conflict? Kind of what's going on. That's your transitional sentence that waves the flag that moves from the opening over into the storytelling phase. Your fourth slide in the deck, I think, is a pretty important one for you to take some time looking at and maybe thinking about. The reason this storytelling phase is important, each party has 3 to 5 minutes to talk about why they think this happened, how it got started, really their perspective on this conflict. Critically important for you as a mediator. You hear bits and pieces of positions. You get little glimpses into issues and interests. It's important for them because it's probably the first time they really had an uninterrupted chance to say, here's what I think's going on. Here's what it looks like from where I sit, stand, live, work. It's probably the first time they've been truly heard, and it lays that foundation for moving on to options, creativity, what else might work. It's sometimes a difficult 3 to 5 minutes to listen to because it's at the beginning. I'm nervous, I'm stressed, I bring emotion, and I sort of just go bloop. Here's what happened. It's critically important. Look at those slides as we go down through there. Spend a little bit of time thinking about what that opening might look like. Again, it's 3 to 5 minutes. I don't interrupt. I take notes. I turn from one person to the other person. I give them a chance to tell their story. I'll give you an example. I'm in the midst of doing a mediation right now. It involves the Denver Performing Arts, and it involves a group called the Brass Brothers. They love to play their brass ensemble on the sidewalk, public right-of-way, right as the patrons are coming out of the different Denver Performing Arts shows. If you're familiar with the Performing Arts Complex, it's an absolutely wonderful place for them to play because there's that large covering and they stand right at the opening in the public right-of-way, so they really aren't controlled by the Performing Arts Center. And they play a saxophone, a trombone, a tuba, a horn, and a set of drums, and they play it right up that what we call sort of the pavilion. And the music just is amplified. Well, the problem is the Performing Arts Center has 5 different venues. And as those venues let out, they let out at different times. And so the Brass Brothers could start playing when the first venue lets out, and the second, third, and fourth venue are still in the midst of performing in the theaters or performing in whichever way that they're doing. And so some of that sound, because it's amplified because over the pavilion, some of that sound reaches down into the foyers and in some instances, maybe even the theaters where those events are being performed. That's disruptive to the patrons. The Performing Arts Center is saying you can't do that. The Brass Brothers are saying, We make a pretty good income doing this because we play for tips, and we'll collect a significant amount of money as those patrons come out because they like the music we play. So we're going to play on the sidewalk where we have a right to play. And they're real quick to go, hey, it's a freedom of speech thing. We get to do that. So interestingly enough, this is kind of an elongated storytelling process. Normally it's a 3 to 5 minute thing. Normally I have them sitting around the table. Normally it takes place there, but this sort of illustrates the point. Last Monday, we weren't certain of the impact of the music on the different venues. And both the performing arts folks as well as the brass brothers said, hey, let's see what that music, how loud really is it? And so it was a dark night. Nobody else was in the theaters. And so we got the brass brothers, all 5 of them out on the sidewalk, and they started playing full bore, just really letting it go. And then I had arranged with them so that I was going to have one of their group and 2 of the performing arts folks, because I want to make sure it's objective. I want to make sure they're both hearing. And we walk from venue to venue to venue. So it's kind of a walking story. Each side is able to show their perspective. We discover that in the foyers of a couple of the different buildings, there clearly is the music. I mean, it's right there. There's no way you could carry on a conversation. There's no way you could have a drink. There's no way it wouldn't disrupt the foyer activity. Much less activity in the theaters, or much less sound in the theaters themselves. So the brass brother who's with us and the 2 performing art folks, interestingly enough, as they're walking along, sort of experiencing the story, they begin to start thinking about and collaborating on, well, we didn't realize that it had this much impact. Or if we could share schedules and actually communicate, we could be a lot more sensitive to what was taking place. Or I thought we could hear it in this theater, but you're right, it's really not something we could. And we move from that sort of animosity, judgmental, you know what, you should not do this, and I have a right. And we move from that as that sort of walking story is unfolding. We move to a much more sort of collaborative spot. Now, you're not going to see it quite that clearly when people are just sitting at the table. You'll see it as the mediation unfolds. That's part of how that process works. But I've been in numerous situations where we've actually had people experiencing, walking through what takes place. I could tell you a long story about golf balls and houses. I'll do that later as we get going. But they started working together because they heard and understood each other's perspective and each other's story. That's what you also see taking place at the table. I meet with Denver Performing Arts and the Brass Brothers this coming week, so we'll see if we actually, get some pieces of an agreement put together out of that. But it was amazing to see where they started before we even started playing the music, where they started in their opinions and their perspectives, and where they moved to as we walked along, listened, heard, talked, sort of shared those stories together. Anyway, enough of that. We'll come back to that. That's what makes the storytelling so critically important. One of the things to watch out for as a mediator, you'll have a tendency to relax, to go, it's just a story. They just need to kind of blow off some emotion. Don't get caught napping. That's a critically important time for you. Pay attention to the details, make notes, and affirm your listening, your active listening skills in that storytelling process. Page 2 of the slide deck. I talk a little bit about the exchange. That's really where we're exploring what's going on. Opening, storytelling, positions to interest, or, in parentheses, exchange. It's a little messy, a little complicated, not nice and neat. You'll see the pictures of the rope, the knot. It's kind of like, both parties grab an end of that pile of rope and they take off running. And of course, it tangles, it knots, it's just a mess. Your job as a mediator, if you want to think about it visually, is to sort of untangle, unravel that rope. Pull the pieces apart, stretch it out, look at it, examine it with the parties themselves. That pile of rope that you see in the picture, that's almost It's a good symbol of the conflict. It's just all knotted up and piled up and doesn't make sense. And that exchange is where typically in a neighbor-to-neighbor mediation, you're going to spend about 45 minutes, maybe a little less, but about 45 minutes really kind of figuring that out, unraveling it, making sense of it. Look through that second page. I think you'll find that helpful. On the third page, I just begin to move into positions and interest. That is a critically important discussion. We're going to talk about that for the next 2-3 weeks. One of the hardest things you do as a mediator, one of the most important things you do as a mediator. We all start conflict from a positional spot. We view it from a positional lens. If you look at the definition that I gave you, a position is my solution to the problem as I understand it. If you really sort of break that sentence down, there's lots of room for problems. My solution to the problem as I understand it. It brings my perspective, it brings my biases, it brings my emotions, it brings every single thing that I got going on to that. And I go, why don't you just, can't you see it my way? Can't you understand? If you just did it my way, we wouldn't have a problem. It makes so much sense. It's logical. It's reasonable. I'm not asking you to do something that you shouldn't already be willing to do. Spend some time looking at that slide. Break each one of those little bullet points down and sort of think about that. We'll come back and we'll talk a lot more about that next week. Second thing down there is issues and interests. This is a little bit of a journey. People start conflict in a positional stance. Your job as a mediator is to move them to an issues or interest stance. That's what I really need when the emotion, the need to be right, goes away. It's when we collectively, collaboratively, cooperatively work together to figure out what would it take to resolve this. Let's go back to my Brass Brothers and my Denver Performing Arts. Clearly a problem. Clearly, on the face of it at least, an insurmountable problem, because you've got one side saying I've got a First Amendment right, you've got another side saying you're impacting my business. And yet I'll bet you we're able to unravel that complicated, knotty conflict, and we're able to find pieces of issues and interests that both of them share and both of them can understand from the other person's perspective. When you get the parties to start working on issues and interests, the tenor of the mediation changes, the attitude and the feeling of the people change, and you will feel it in your gut viscerally. You'll feel that shift take place. But again, more about that next week. We're done talking about it now. Take a look at those slides. They're going to come back up again. We're going to spend time with them. Third thing I want to just mention is perspective. Your assignment's going to revolve around perspective. That's kind of how I look at things. It's in some ways my reality. I own it. It's mine. It belongs to me. It makes sense to me. It's how I've made sense and order of whatever it is I'm up against. And so spend a little bit of time thinking about perspective. What does that mean for conflict? What does that mean for people learning to accept another perspective, yet hold on to theirs? It's a real challenge. You've got to, as a mediator, understand sort of the complexity of bringing people with different perspectives that's truly their reality. They just didn't wake up in the morning and go, you know what, I'm just going to think about this in an obnoxious, unmanageable manner. They own that. It's what it looks like to them. It's real to them. Look at the videos that I posted up. Spend some time thinking about that. We'll come back and we'll revisit it. But this sort of sets the context, sort of sets the stage for you moving into that difficult exchange, positions to interest phase of mediation. Anyway, I'll be interested to see what you think about it. Talk to you next week.